Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here, as always, with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Timothy O'Toole. What is up, Tim?
What is up, Brian? Today is well-dressed guest day.
Yes, well-dressed guest day. Tim and I threatened to throw them off because they were too well-dressed, but thankfully they abided by our instructions. We have two very well-dressed guests that are going to be joining us in just a second. But before we get there, let's just dispense with the normal preliminary matters. Thanks to everybody for joining us again. Thanks to everybody who listened to the most recent episode and sent in feedback, questions, comments, tweets. We really appreciate it. As always, we are not going to be discussing any confidential information today. We're not giving out legal advice. Any and all opinions that you hear are solely attributable to me and Tim and our two guests who will be joining us and be introduced in just a moment. Don't blame anybody else. Blame the four of us. If you don't like what we have to say, if you are a fan of the pod, please subscribe. You can find us anywhere you get your content. Please give us a rating, hopefully a 5-star rating. Spread the word about Embargoed. We appreciate the continued support. So without much further delay, after some technical difficulties, we were up and running with our full cast of characters for today. We are, as we teased on the last episode, we wanted to focus this time around on issues relating to forced labor, in particular, business and human rights, and as they relate most directly at the moment to what's going on in China and specifically in Xinjiang. And these are obviously topics Tim and I talk about a lot, but we are bringing on today a couple of guests, our friends and colleagues, Mr. Richard Mojica, third-time guest on Embargoed. What's up, Ricky? How are you?
Hey, how's it going?
And another one of our Miller Chevalier colleagues, our good friend and first-time podcast guest, Mr. Nate Lankford. Nate, how are you?
Thank you. How are you guys doing?
We're good. We are good. And so we're very happy to have Richard and Nate on to cover this issue from a slightly different perspective than Tim and I typically cover it from, and to bring some insight and some thoughts on what's happening in this space from both kind of a big picture and then from an enforcement perspective and then also from the compliance perspective. And our timing could not be better because, and we invite everybody to give us credit for being prescient here, but less than an hour before we started recording, there was a joint advisory that was issued by the U.S. government on an update to the Xinjiang supply chain business advisory that was issued last year, a joint update issued by Treasury, State, Commerce, Homeland Security, USTR, and Labor. And so this is precisely what we are going to cover today, is what is covered in that advisory, which of course we would encourage everybody out there to download and read on their own. But it's timely, and so we had a suspicion this was going to be timely, and we were proven right before we even started. So without any more delay, let me kick it to Nate to sort of walk us into the topic a little bit and maybe just share a little bit of an overview as to sort of some of the work he does on behalf of clients in the business and human rights space, and specifically on forced labor topics, as that's going to, I think, tie us into and bring us into the broader discussion. So let me flip it over to Nate to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Brian. And yeah, thanks again for inviting us to talk. I'm very excited about participating today. This is my favorite podcast, so I just want to get that out there right now. I'm a huge fan.
Wait. I think now is the time for cross-examination on this issue.
Nate's nose is growing as he speaks, by the way. He resembles Pinocchio with every word he utters. But anyway, go ahead.
I love you guys. I'm sincere. So this issue of forced labor and supply chains is really important, and it cuts across a number of different areas. And so I think that's why it's really great to talk about it on a program like this, because it touches on so many different enforcement tools of so many different countries, and for companies, it's a really prevalent risk. I mean, I think we're all familiar with like the general stats issued by the ILO about the prevalence of forced labor just globally, that it's significant and it's out there. And even though I think what makes the headlines a lot these days is issues in China and Xinjiang, first of all, that, which may sound like a niche issue, it really is tied into so many different things that companies do. And the raw materials that have been the focus of some of these different enforcement actions on the import front really touch a lot of different companies. And it's not just in China, it's in places like Malaysia. And so like really any company with an extended supply chain, it's really worth paying attention to these issues. I think one other thing that sort of just struck me in talking about it on a show that usually focuses on sanctions, export controls, is really how this what Richard and I are going to talk about, I think, about import restrictions in the U.S. Really showcase how the U.S. in particular goes about addressing these kinds of issues, and it really focuses on cutting off, decoupling companies that have high risks from the U.S. supply chain through sanctions, entities listings, and also through import restrictions. And so I think the way we're looking at it is that this is, that highlights the U.S. approach. It's certainly like very topical politically because of the motivations, like then the relationship between U.S. and China these days, which makes it a real big priority for legislators and enforcers. But it's also something that's really worth looking at in the broader context, because I know that that's the way that companies are really looking at it. It's not just a U.S. enforcement thing. It's really part of what some people have referred to as the galaxy of norms in business and human rights. And it's a great expression. It's one coined by our friends, Mitt Regan and Elise Cruz Diggs. Wrote a great article on this. It shows this galaxy of norms ranging from hard law to soft law and the different way countries are addressing this issue. And so, in that galaxy are things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which set out companies' fundamental responsibility to respect human rights, and ranging into hard law things like sanctions and the things we'll talk about with import restrictions.
Can I chime in there just to ask? Obviously, we collectively and the four of us work on these types of issues together pretty often at this point now. Coming at it from the different angles and the different regulatory regimes you mentioned, and obviously we are U.S. lawyers. We have clients all over the globe, and many of whom have ties to China and Malaysia and other places that have these issues. In terms of other jurisdictions, you mentioned the UN, but in terms of other jurisdictions, obviously I know Tim and I have seen this crop up in speaking with counsel and clients in the UK and the EU. But in terms of your sense of how the rest of the world is kind of handling this, as is it in a sort of similar fashion to the way the U.S. is it trending in that direction, or what's your just sort of sense overall in terms of how the regulatory landscape looks kind of globally on this?
Thanks. It's a really good question. It's one that I think is a subject of a lot of discussion in business human rights circles, because the U.S. Way of dealing with this is somewhat idiosyncratic.
As it is in sanctions, as it is in just about every area. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Right. I remember a few years ago when this was sort of the enforcement on the customs front was really picking up, and we started seeing this stuff mentioned really explicitly in sanctions. Made the point of, that really seems to be the emerging strategy of cutting people off from the economic system here. And it was, kind of puzzling to people from a European perspective that operate under, say, France's duty of vigilance law, where there's mandatory human rights due diligence, or who are operating under the UK Modern Slavery Act regime, where there's mandatory reporting requirements and what you're doing to prevent forced labor. And so this issue of addressing it primarily through sanctions, import restrictions is certainly a different approach. However, I think for companies, there are some unifying themes, and you'll see, like, as we talk about this, like what companies are actually doing is to assess risks, prevent forced labor, is informed by all of these things, and they do mesh together, I think, under these like principles of fundamental due diligence, being aware of your risks, taking appropriate steps to address them.
Let me ask one follow-up question, both for you and Richard, before we kind of pivot to the next area here, which is something that you mentioned that we've talked about a lot. I think we've talked about with Richard on prior pods, which is this idea of decoupling from China, and decoupling supply chains, decoupling multinational businesses from China. That's something you hear a lot. That's something that's obviously a high policy priority within the U.S. for a whole host of reasons. And to the extent that I would venture to say that forced labor considerations and human rights abuses are not sort of the sole instigating factor there on the U.S. side, but is certainly an important one. And I think under the Biden administration, and has one that has gained even more kind of traction and importance. But I guess in terms of that process of decoupling, I guess, what do you see in terms of the progress that's been made, or where companies are currently in their sort of general thought process about whether they can ride it out in China, for lack of a better term, or whether they really do need to sort of think about picking up stakes and perhaps leaving and reorienting and rerouting supply chains?
I think companies are really seeing two very important emerging trends and priorities in the business and human rights area, and just in the U.S. political area, really gaining momentum and reinforcing each other. Obviously, I think we all know the political dynamics on the forced labor front. The cascade of reports that come out from NGOs, civil society groups, media on what's been going on there since 2017, in terms of detentions, reports of torture, and the scale of it, I think is really grabbed the public's attention, grabbed legislators' attention, and it seems to be also fairly convenient for people that are really concerned about sort of the ties between, for political purposes, between the U.S. and China. So I think that the sense, I think, is that most companies think that this is an area of risk that will increase in terms of enforcement, and that will become a hotter issue. I mean, it's already hot, but that this is definitely a very rapidly developing area. And so, Richard, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. One is that in that way, it differs from the tariffs. I think the companies generally, I think the perception was that they could ride out the tariffs, and that there was going to be a point in time when these tariffs, perhaps when Donald Trump left office, that everything would go back to not the same as it was before, but that essentially they could ride out the tariffs for a certain amount of time. And to a certain extent, that has proven to be true. And we didn't see perhaps the mass exodus out of China that the government expected, and certainly not the nearshoring or reshoring to the U.S. that the Trump administration would have liked. But when it comes to business and human rights and these human rights issues, in particular forced labor, they're touching a different nerve, and I think that nerve is so politically charged, and it comes at a time where brands are very sensitive to the perception of consumers, that it is causing companies to rethink their sourcing decisions. And the immediate reaction that we've seen companies take, or some companies take, is to segregate the U.S. supply chain from the other supply chains for now. So clearly the U.S. is leading the charge on enforcement. So for the time being, companies are making or are prioritizing the efforts to ensure that their due diligence and other documentation, paperwork efforts, et cetera, are tight, so that they can kind of demonstrate to the U.S. regulators that there is no forced labor in their supply chain. Soon, I think that this is not something where they're going to be able to, this will be only kind of a U.S. facing effort, but as these laws get teeth around the world, we're going to see, imports into Europe, imports into Canada, imports into other markets have the same restrictions. And I think this is just going to balloon into something bigger. And that will, to answer your question, in effect, have a more significant decoupling effect than did the tariffs.
Yeah, one last thought, and I'll throw this to Tim actually before we kind of pivot to discuss enforcement. But it occurs to me, or just my observation from seeing the efforts that you're talking about, and we're going to talk about more in a moment with respect to the WROs and other import enforcement, the number of blocked entities that are in the region now, and U.S. sanctions considerations, the number of entities that are on the entity list. And by all accounts, sort of more forthcoming on all of those fronts, is that also from a practical compliance perspective, that that accumulation of regulatory risks is such that companies are saying, well, when is it too much? When do we just have to pick up stakes and leave, or do we have to, like you said, have an entirely kind of clean or China-free U.S. supply chain because we just can't manage these risks on the ground? So, Tim, curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, this discussion has made me think a little bit about some of the dangers of this policy, because on the one hand, I do think it will have the effect of decoupling from China. But if that is really kind of part of the goal, you worry that kind of by mixing those two messages, one of like national security and the other of human rights, that there'll be the perception that this human rights policy is just really a fig leaf for what the U.S. wanted to do as a foreign policy priority. And if that becomes the perception, I have some worries. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think, that there are other countries that are vulnerable to human rights issues, and to essentially use human rights as kind of a wedge to get a foreign policy goal becomes a little problematic, because then you pick and choose among your allies and your adversaries, and it looks like we're picking on China because we really, for a trade reason, and using a human rights issue to do that. When I don't think that's really what's going on here, but I do think that to the extent that it furthers our foreign policy goals that we've already expressed in terms of decoupling, it does run the risk of being viewed as kind of a fig leaf justification for doing something that we want to do, which plays into the hands of the Chinese, because that's really how they're pitching this, as just an internal matter that other countries are interfering with for their own purposes, and that they really don't care about human rights at all.
Not to mention, also related to that, the vulnerability that the U.S. has of being cast as totally hypocritical and lacking credibility in this space in light of what was going on for the 4 years under Trump, and then perhaps even things that continue to this day on the human rights front domestically. So there is that complication as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, in the business and human rights space, it's really all about the affected stakeholders, like just the importance, the way companies aspire to look at it, what companies are really charged with doing under the UN guiding principles in business and human rights is really to take a affected stakeholder approach to these kinds of issues. And the more that it becomes a political issue, the less it seems like it's being driven by a sincere concern like that. So I agree that there is a very strong tension there.
And that's maybe a good segue between and a good sort of refocusing at the end there of sort of what this discussion is really all about at core. But with that, I think we do need to talk and maybe to turn it to Richard here to lead us in the next portion of this, which is enforcement, and in particular, the enforcement that we're seeing out of CBP, because notwithstanding what Tim and I talk about all the time with respect to additions to the entity list, more sanctions under the Magnitsky Act, targeting human rights abuses in China, it really does seem, and especially in the last, let's say, 6 to 9 months, it really does seem like CBP in many ways is kind of leading the charge here in terms of the U.S. enforcement efforts, and in some ways has the sharpest tools in the toolbox to do that. So let me toss it to Richard to sort of share some thoughts on sort of what he's, as a CBP alum, sort of what he's seeing there and what he's expecting to see going forward.
Yeah, this is really interesting and somewhat unexpected, because a year ago, and for the past maybe 2 or 3 years before that, the focus for trade lawyers and certainly for customs lawyers like myself was helping companies work through the issues associated with the tariffs. That was what most people were doing, and it became this above the fold issue that became a CEO issue, and it was one of the for the first times in my career where a customs issue was such an important issue. And it's interesting that that issue was quickly replaced with this one, and for the affected companies, it has become an issue that is as important, if not more important, and so it has generated a lot of interest, a lot of press, and it's just kind of like right at the heart of the U.S.-China relations. So it's just become huge, and I think it's just in a way unexpected that customs, an agency that has traditionally been, let's say, a less public, less aggressive enforcer than some of the other agencies that you guys work with more regularly.
Very diplomatic on your part.
Is at the forefront?
Thank you.
Well, it's something that's new for everyone. It's new for customs, and it's new for the folks that are for the companies, and for the folks that are assisting the companies in deal with this issue. So customs and DHS are at the forefront, and basically, if we step back, the prohibition is quite simple. The Tariff Act of 1930 prohibits the importation of goods that are made in whole or in part with forced labor, and you take that relatively simple to digest law, and we've been working over the past year or so to kind of tease it out exactly kind of what it means and come up with a framework of how customs is implementing the law. The deal is basically that if you have merchandise that customs suspects is subject to this law, to this prohibition, meaning that it's made in whole or in part by forced labor, it can detain the merchandise. And if it then confirms that it was in fact made by forced labor, it can seize the merchandise. The big tool here has been what's called withhold release orders. So basically, as a result of an investigation that generally starts with an NGO report or some other allegation, and is usually also supplemented by customs' own internal investigation, customs will issue a detention order on certain products, and this withhold release order can affect either one or more companies. Generally, these are exporters, foreign exporters, manufacturers. They can affect all products coming from a region, like cotton from the Xinjiang region in China, or they can affect all certain products coming from a country, like tobacco from Malawi. So there's different ways to graph this.
A withhold release order, what you're saying, is a lot more dramatic than its name might suggest, right?
Well, but it's also not as dramatic. Yes, but it's also not as dramatic as it is reported. It's reported as an import ban, and it's not a ban. It's a detention order that that at least in theory, and I think this is where we want to spend most of the time, in theory can be overcome. So if your product, once customs issues a withhold release order, it makes it public. And then if it determines that the products that a company is attempting to import are covered by that withhold release order, it will detain that merchandise. And it will give the opportunity to the importer to demonstrate or provide what they call proof of admissibility. And the importer then has 3 months to provide proof of admissibility to convince customs to release the merchandise. That's where we enter kind of the gray zone, because customs has a relatively low bar to detain the merchandise. It must have reasonable but not conclusive evidence to suggest that the products were made in whole or in part by forced labor. So mind you, their customs will not articulate the reasons for why how it arrived at that conclusion, but in theory, at least, it's supposed to have that. And I really do think, customs has been taking a careful approach. So I really do think that these detentions are generally backed by that reasonable suspicion, which again, everyone kind of knows is a low bar. But once customs detains that merchandise, there are no regulations that elaborate on exactly what the importer needs to provide in order to release the good. In other words, there is no standard for release. And that's what we've been working on over the past year or so. We're helping companies kind of work through that in preparing submissions to customs and working with the various customs offices to kind of provide information and slowly determine whether what we have provided is enough. And the frustration so far, and I'll turn to Nate after this, the frustration so far has been that it's very much, the process is still very opaque, very not very transparent. And so when we have, although we have been successful in some instances, and that has been good, we have also encountered several instances where the company is, operating in very good faith. They believe they have excellent due diligence in their supply chains. They provide, massive submissions with all types of audits and traceability and a whole bunch of information to kind of support the claim that there is no forced labor. And customs tells you, we're not going to release the merchandise because we still have your proof of admissibility did not overcome our suspicion, and we're not going to tell you anything beyond that. So that's a big kind of concern that we have in this area that is constantly evolving. And Nate, maybe you have something to add to that.
Before you turn to Nate, actually, Richard, I have a technical question about this. So the new advisory that came out today actually has an appendix that goes through all of the forced or the withhold release orders for Xinjiang. And so, like, for example, in January, there was an order that involved cotton and tomato products from Xinjiang. Do these orders say all cotton and tomato products, or are they more narrow into particular types or from particular producers? I mean, what are the mechanics of those orders?
A withhold release order so far can have 3 modalities. One is where it lists the specific manufacturer exporters in, for example, China, that are covered. So it basically says a recent withhold release order on silica-based products is a good example. There's in June, customs issued a withhold release order on silica-based products manufactured by Hoshine Silicon Industry and its subsidiaries. So basically, if you have any connection, if you have a product that includes silica-based products that has a connection to Hoshine or its subsidiaries, that product is covered by the WRO and is subject to a detention and potential seizure. So that's one example. Then you have other examples when it's broader. So for example, you have cotton, tomatoes, and downstream products from the Xinjiang region. That's also issued this year, and that covers all cotton, all tomatoes, and downstream products like ketchup or like apparel that can be traced back to Xinjiang. And then you have the even broader scenario, which, as far as I know, I know two examples. One is cotton from Turkmenistan, and the other one is tobacco from Malawi. So that's kind of like, at that point, it's even broader than regional. It's countrywide.
Yeah, and I think one real bottom line takeaway that here is that although it may seem perhaps limited in scope because it has to do with like a particular location, a particular supplier, a particular product, supply chains are so complex, as we know. It's just incredible how big an effect something like this can have on an industry. When you think about the many stages that cotton goes through till final product, or that polysilicon goes through, and the concentration of production sometimes, like as we've seen in China and Xinjiang, in those areas, it's just amazing how many companies that this can touch. And so I think that, like, when we think about this as like an area that's a hot topic that will continue to be a focus, it really does make us take a hard look and think about, say, what industries could potentially be next, or what regions could be next.
Yeah, there's to add to that, there are currently 51 active withhold release orders covering a broad range of products and a number of different countries, and 6 of those were issued in fiscal year 20, or to date have been issued in fiscal year 2021. But the big number that I think I keep going back to, and I think is really telling about the enforcement climate right now, is that if you look at years past, the number of detentions, the number of customs detentions was a very small number. It's been picking up gradually, and this year it exploded. So according to stats that Customs put out at the end of last month, there are almost 700 shipments that have been detained under the 6 withhold release orders that were issued recently. And part of that is that the cotton WRO is so broad, has such a broad reach that it's affecting a whole bunch of different apparel companies through a number of different types of products. And so I think as the effort continues to expand, we're just going to see a continued growth of the number of detentions, and also likely maybe an increase in the scope of the WROs.
Yeah, if you go to the advisory that came out today, it has a list of industries in Xinjiang that should be viewed, I guess, as suspect, and I assume all of these would be the proper topic of a withhold release order. So you've got cell phones, you've got a bunch of agricultural products. It's not just tomatoes. Mm-hmm. You've got electronics assembly. You've got a kind of a roadmap for what WROs might come later, and they could all be quite extensive in terms of their effect on supply chains, I would think.
Yeah, I'd say Xinjiang has provided kind of a good case study, and certainly I feel bad saying it this way, but I guess the poster child of this effort. But I think it's important to also keep in mind that it's an effort that will expand and has expanded way beyond China, right? So there are other countries where the government has serious concerns over recruitment freeze and other human rights issues, such as Malaysia, and that even within the Xinjiang effort, it's not only limited to the Xinjiang region, but also other areas in China where there are government subsidies, where minority workers are also potentially affected. So the scope of any due diligence program that we're working on not only is focused on Xinjiang, but also on the broader China region and in some of the other areas, because as we mentioned, downstream products are covered. So it's not only, and that is really, I think, the trick from the difficulty from an enforcement perspective. If you have an input that starts in Xinjiang, but then two tiers down, it's turned into a completely different product, and is eventually exported and then imported to the U.S. from a country other than China. You have a very difficult time kind of identifying those connections.
Let me maybe ask one final question to kind of wrap up the enforcement discussion before we pivot to compliance. But so clear that the net that is being cast here, very broad. And as you walked us through before, Richard, some successes, some not successful attempts to sort of get these detention, to make the case that these goods should not be detained, and overcome what sounds to me like essentially you're more or less guilty until proven innocent kind of standard that CBP is holding companies to in terms of use of sourcing from forced labor that are subject to these WROs. So what is, as a practical matter, what does a company do if you get to the end of that process and you're told, you get the very disappointing answer, even though they've proceeded in good faith, provided tons of information, and think that you have at least made a good case to overcome the presumption and maybe get the detention released? You're told no, and we're not telling you why. What does a company do at that point? You made comments about sort of it's a very opaque process, not a lot of transparency. It strikes me that this is something that Tim and I have been talking about a lot, which is, in the context where we live in export and sanctions restrictions, we've seen, and some of the executive orders that came out in the last year, we've seen successful court challenges on those fronts, under due process grounds, APA challenges, et cetera. Is there anything like that in the works? Is that where you go if you're dissatisfied with this? I understand that may be a sort of a fraught cost benefit analysis for a company to make, because you're going to expend a lot and you're going to bring more attention to what's not a very a sort of unsavory situation or allegation relating to forced labor that companies aren't going to necessarily want to put front and center. But what happens then? What are the options, perhaps, of a company that gets to the end of that road in terms of just dealing with CBP and gets the no?
Right. So there's what you're instructed to do with a merchandise first, which is to, if you're told that if CBP refuses to admit the merchandise, what's referred to as excluding the merchandise, if the merchandise is excluded from admission, then the importer must either export or destroy the merchandise. But I think that, the more interesting question that you're asking is whether there's, an opportunity then to challenge the administrative action in court. And the answer is yes. And to date, we're aware of one court case filed by an importer of palm derivatives, palm oil derivatives. So, the merchandise doesn't really matter, but it raises at the court for the first time this issue of due process and transparency that I think is at the heart of the enforcement effort from the private practice and company point of view.
And as we always talk about on our side, what does that administrative record justifying detention or exclusion really look like? Right. And it sounds like the answer is nobody really knows, what it looks like.
No one knows. And we've been there are several offices involved in this in this process within customs. About 4 or 5 offices play a role in any detention. And certainly if you challenge it, you tend to escalate so that the lawyer, so chief counsel, and the Office of Forced Labor in headquarters and other offices get involved. But even then, even under that more exhaustive review, your customs is not providing additional information as to the justification, and their basic rationale is that this is a law enforcement proceeding and that they're not required to do so. as part of the law, and there are the regulations don't prompt that either.
And I
So-
guarantee you that is the hill they're going to die on unless or until they're told by a court that they have to do otherwise.
I think so. I think
Right. so.
So.
Although that's the hill that the 13959 lawsuits died on from the government perspective. I mean, once a suit was brought, they had to explain those designations, and it turned out they were creating them retroactively because they hadn't even really written down what it was, and then they did a crappy job. So it may be that a lawsuit is really what it's going to take to get CBP to come up with some rationale for this,
or at least explain it, and reveal it, right? Yeah.
So there's a single lawsuit in place right now, and I know that there's an interest by some of the industry groups that have been involved to perhaps participate and add to it, and that maybe some will bring additional cases. We really don't know the strength of the case that was brought, so we don't. So it's hard to know whether it's a great case to challenge or not. But I think fundamentally, the basic instance that is being challenged of give us more information. If you're gonna detain and take our property, we should know more. You should be required to give us more. I think that's just basically it. So sorry, Nate, I interrupted you.
Oh no, I was just thinking it's interesting for me to think about the practical incentives as well that are sort of unique to the customs area in terms of like the kind of challenges that Tim's talking about in terms of timing, things being detained, and what if you did succeed at the end of this process of litigation, would that give you any kind of satisfying relief? I don't know, Richard, I know you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, thoughts that I've heard from companies is that it doesn't, because it takes, let's say it takes a year and a half, maybe more, for the court case to from start to end. And in the meantime, let's say you import tomatoes, or let's say you import palm oil or apparel, no matter what a commodity is, pretty much, it will be stale by then, and so. And so from a product use perspective, you no longer have, it's not much of an incentive. And what you do is you elevate the kind of PR risk that a company faces on this issue, because even if you have a fantastic program, if you up to the point where you bring it up to the court case, it's all a private proceeding between the importer and customs, and that's something very important. The moment you file a lawsuit, then of course it's no longer private. So you threaten kind of tarnishing the reputation of the company in a way that what we've seen so far is that companies are not particularly interested in doing. So on one hand, you have. We've seen with several clients that we feel that we have a very good case in terms of bringing it, and a very good record has been laid out in terms of we are not getting enough information. This cannot be fair, but there's that there are those limiting factors which I think in the short term are going to be barriers for some companies to move forward with litigation.
Yeah, what you're describing also is very similar to what we see in the sanctions and export controls context, where the cost benefit just doesn't really align for most companies to plow forward with a court challenge, unless it's sort of an existential threat and it's like, well, we have nothing to lose, let's take this to court, or it's just as a matter of principle that they just can't abide whatever it is that the agency is trying to tag them with in terms of a violation. So, but it's rare. It's we've seen more instances of it lately. I think in part because there was the feeling like, well, we have nothing to lose, because if this stands, then we're gonna be out of business, or we're not going to be doing business in the U.S. anymore, or whatever. But it's still, you have to have that the alignment is difficult to get that.
Well, I mean, and you've got to have the case. I mean, so Xiaomi had a pretty good case that they weren't affiliated with the Chinese military, so they were a good company to bring that challenge. And there were, it was their reliance on U.S. investors that was going to be cut off by that program was so great that they had there was an upside to bringing the suit and a real downside to not bringing it. I mean, in terms of these suits, I mean, the risk is reputational, and that is going to always be there, that you elevate the issue. And I think that is an issue in the cases that we see as well. But the other thing that I would say in this area, so for example, if you're going to challenge the order about tomatoes in Xinjiang, you'd have to be prepared to take the position that there's that forced labor is not infecting that sort of production, and potentially to either prove it or respond to whatever the government's proof is on that. And that strikes me as, a big task in taking on the question of whether a particular industry is infected by forced labor, is a finding that, assuming there's any support for it, you'd really have to take on and prove yourself innocent, which would be which would make a lot of these cases really tough cases. Maybe there's a more narrow version of it.
You're absolutely right. I mean, a phrase that we use a lot when discussing the enforcement context is that currently importers have to prove a negative. So they have to prove the absence of forced labor, and they have to do it generally. In every single industry that we've worked on, they have to do it beyond the contours of their own company and related companies, but with a number of different unrelated suppliers, going back several tiers in the supply chain. For those that have been working on this space like us know this anecdote, but for others, they might find it interesting that when customs detains the merchandise, detains a shipment, one of the documents that they request, for example, for a shipment of cotton sweaters, is the time cards that are for the people that pick the cotton used to make the sweater. So anyone that knows anything about supply chains knows that is essentially impossible, and that you're being, if you think of going back these very complex supply chains and all the way back 6-7 tiers to get that level of detail, you start to think that, well, maybe this is really not about, maybe there's just no way to win, because the bar is set too high, and even if you have a top-notch program, there's just it's too difficult to overcome.
So let me seize on that. I think that's a great segue to our final topic, in terms of a top-notch program and proving negatives, and what do you need to be doing, or what do companies need to be doing to be proactive here, and to sort of buttress these risks as best they can, given how active the enforcement climate is. So let me maybe kick it over to Nate to start us off here, as we perhaps try to get through this a little more quickly than we had planned to go through the compliance piece of this. But just in light of everything we've talked about, what are some things that you and Richard are talking to clients about, or the kind of problems you're helping them troubleshoot in terms of program development, thinking through these problems, maybe in a calmer, forward-looking way, and not necessarily just in the throes of an enforcement action?
Thanks. Yeah. Really, I guess I'll start with just putting it plainly. It's not a brilliant sort of observation, but really what companies are doing are taking a very hard look at their risks and their compliance efforts to address those risks, and really everything flows from that. It's like the basic concept of due diligence in the human rights space, and the extent of those efforts naturally varies a lot when you think about companies that are subject to current WROs versus other companies that say may have operations that touch on things that are relevant to current WROs, like manufacturing in China, connections with Xinjiang, Malaysia, other places. And so you see obviously a lot of different approaches that are commensurate with the risks that companies are seeing. And so really, like, the goals of these efforts are, first of all, to make sure that you're effectively assessing and mitigating forced labor risks in your company and also in your supply chain, and making sure at the same time that these efforts are systematic, that they're documented, so that the company's in a position to provide meaningful assurances to stakeholders as necessary if they should face inquiries, say from CBP, from customers, which is happening more and more frequently, investors, civil society, media. And so really these compliance efforts in practical terms, what we call it is developing a compliance program. And I think that anybody who's worked in-house in, say, sanctions areas, anti-corruption areas, really any area of corporate compliance, you're sort of familiar with the building blocks of that. It involves policies and procedures like codes of conduct, third-party due diligence procedures, screening of third parties is another major component, and compliance management. When you think of ongoing risk assessment, continuous improvement, things like training are some really big areas. And I think there's so much very good and authoritative guidance on this that's out there. But what we're seeing is that now that CBP has really emerged as this very important enforcer, people are naturally paying a lot more attention to the guidance that they issue, the guidance that they cite, that they may talk about, in discussions with people or in public, conferences or whatever. And so we track that closely. I mean, just in practical terms, we certainly look at their reasonable care publications, and really authoritative overviews of what a compliance program should look like. They often cite to the Department of Labor's Comply Chain, which in turn cites to the responsible sourcing tool, which was developed by our friends at Verite in collaboration with the U.S. Department of State. And so we really track a lot of this, and then really see what it means for companies that are, say, starting from scratch or that are more mature, and how they can strengthen their program or better memorialize it and make it and communicate it to the stakeholders. And so, I mean, naturally, that's something we're tracking closely. Anybody that's interested, Richard and I are happy to follow up with that.
Yeah, one related question I have, which is, this is kind of the classic question that you get from clients on any of these areas, but one of the examples that Richard just cited a few minutes ago kind of made me think of this, which is that if you're going to get the request from CBP for time cards, let's say, and you're talking to a company that you're working with on doing an audit or doing a risk assessment of their operations and their supply chain, and that's potentially on the table, right? Is it, well, are we going to go all the way back to the sort of lowest level supplier that we can find and do that, try to copy or collect, the time cards? How do you draw those lines, or how do you assess kind of how much, whether that's let's say strictly necessary perhaps, or advisable in a particular situation, number one, and then what are some of the practical obstacles that get in the way there? And there I'm thinking of a number of different things, which is, especially in China, you're dealing with the kind of a hostile local government, and now kind of blocking laws and anti-sanctions laws and other measures that are in place to really prevent people from being able to comply with this regime in particular. So how are we, and that's really for both of you, for Richard and Nate, sort of how are you helping kind of look at those questions and assess those questions, and then sort of what are some of the either legal or regulatory or practical impediments that companies are gonna face as they're trying to sort this out?
Right. That's a great question. I have to say that, and that's something that I think occupies a lot of our current attention, is really because we are dealing, of course, with limited resources, and we have to think about where we can effectively direct them, and what gets them is most important to CBP, and in a lot of ways I feel like we're sort of assisting CBP in a way of really educating, them and people about what you really reasonably can get. And so I think the way that we're seeing companies go about this is as I said, starting with the risk assessment, is just a real core initial building block where you sort of map your supply chain. You really find out what are your supply chain connections and relationships, and the materials that are really presenting the most risk to you, and so you would focus your efforts there. And then
let me ask you, let me stop you there, Nate. So in terms of a risk assessment, I mean, given what's going on right now, I mean, wouldn't the risk of having anything sourced from Xinjiang be probably so exceptionally high that the only real advice is to just get out? I mean, because the compliance challenges seem unmeetable. I mean, if you're going to have to go get time cards, not only just sample time cards from any of your suppliers there to show that they're actually paying their people, but then if, going forward, you'd have to have the ability to go back. And the idea that you could go to Xinjiang and get those time cards, given the atmosphere there right now, seems almost zero. So
right.
I just don't see any option. If you do the risk assessment, you start to see anything being sourced from Xinjiang, and particularly items that are on that appendix list of the industries where the U.S. has seen forced labor. I don't know how you would comply with it, but maybe you have some.
No, I think that it's a really good point, and you're right that this risk assessment part of it is so key to get to the point where you can sort of pinpoint, those supply chain links that present those kind of risks, and if you are finding materials sourced from Xinjiang, what companies are up against is that the climate there in terms of access by companies, by reputable third-party auditors, is so affected by the degree of surveillance and fears about what kind of consequences the personal risks to their auditors and to people who speak with their auditors, that we're finding a lot of the most reputable auditors that you would typically go in to get a sense of these things and to get that kind of documentation, are no longer operating there. And so that really is at least for the time being. So that is like, when you think about the kind of things that Richard was talking about, and that you ultimately would need to prove a negative through documentation, and you're dealing with this kind of significant obstacle, that you can see how this would play out into a company's sort of analysis of, say, what they want to, how they may want to structure their supply chain differently, so that they can, if they are asked, they can provide some more satisfactory answers. But also in this time card issue, I think that if you're dealing with something where you could sort of theoretically get that, say, out of Xinjiang, if you had cooperation every way down the supply chain, and the practical implications of people, just for a whole bunch of business and commercial reasons, not wanting to, say, give their supplier relationship information to a party like 3-4 tiers up the supply chain. You can see that you run into a bunch of practical difficulties. And I think the most important thing is really making systematic efforts to try and get the things that customs has asked and would likely ask in these kind of situations. And then, to the extent that you can't, to have a very thoughtful, clear narrative about what obstacles you faced and why you can't get them, so that you're in a position to account for that limitation.
Nate, let me add a point to Tim's question as well. Tim, I think you're right. If you have a connection to Xinjiang, odds are you're screwed. It's hard.
Term of art. That's a term of art.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, let me clarify that. Not a connection in general, a connection in the U.S. supply chain, because that is the scope of CBP's jurisdiction. So the products that are presented for importation, can you link them back to an entity in Xinjiang? Odds are it's difficult. It's really difficult to prove the absence of forced labor, even if there is no forced labor at that facility, because of these of what Nate has mentioned, that it's difficult to prove that there is no forced labor because you're not, auditors aren't going in there, and you're coming in with a presumption of with a de facto kind of presumption of forced labor to begin with. So for that reason, I think it's very hard. And you see, for instance, the folks in the solar industry who import to the United States have, from what we understand, made the decision to move away from Xinjiang, at least as it concerns the U.S. supply chain. So I think that's point number one. And point number two is that Xinjiang isn't always the main concern. So the reason why you do traceability is an equally important reason to do traceability is to demonstrate that your products aren't coming from Xinjiang. So this happens a lot, for example, in the apparel industry. You have a product that is manufactured in China. The importing, the documents that customs gets show the manufacturers being a Chinese company, and there's a WRO on Xinjiang cotton. So what customs wants to see is that if you're telling them our cotton doesn't come from Xinjiang, our cotton comes from India, as is often the case, that you can show that you can provide proof to demonstrate that that's the case. So it kind of goes both ways. I mean, the reasons why you need a solid traceability program is also to demonstrate that there is no Xinjiang in those type of scenarios.
Yeah, that's just been like a huge focus, traceability programs. From a compliance perspective, I mean, I think that's just been a huge investment of time and resources by companies, because it's related to understanding of the supply chain for risk assessment purposes, but also, to position yourself and, knowing what the relationships are, knowing what kind of documentation you could provide. And I think like going through mock WRO exercises is sort of an interesting compliance trend as well, where a company would select this is of course something we're working with companies on, would select a shipment, and say, if this were detained, let's go through how we would deal with it. And so, issuing a document request that very much resembles what CBP would issue, and most importantly, like starting the clock running, because there's a finite amount of time that you can respond to this, and if you're getting information not just from your own files but from suppliers' files, you really want to pay attention to the turnaround times on those things.
Yeah, it strikes me, just as sort of one final comment, that obviously on the sanction side, we worry often about ownership and tracing ownership interests, and sometimes that's very opaque and murky, and especially in places like China and Russia. And on the anti-corruption side, we're worried about government affiliations and control and other things like that, and that can be murky, especially with third parties in many countries. But it strikes me that traceability is really a level above in terms of the granularity and the challenge, just the practical challenge that provides companies, or it presents to companies rather. And this is in general still a pretty new aspect of all this, right? And people are just really getting their arms around it. And so, not surprising that there are some people are moving in fits and starts, or trying to really ramp up quickly, but it's challenging, obviously.
Yeah, Brian, let me add just a point to that. I've been taking some notes here, things I just wanted to add on based on what you've been saying. The first is on that point, traceability is king right now. It's very important that a company have a robust internal compliance program of the type that Nate described. But at the end of the day, when for purposes of not for these important human rights objectives, but for the purpose of releasing your merchandise at customs, you must be able to have you must be able to demonstrate through a robust traceability mechanism the origin of the inputs that go into your product. So that's why we get to this conclusion that at the moment traceability is king. Another point that we haven't discussed is that so far in this podcast, we've talked about the detention, right? There's, what happens, your merchandise is going to be detained and it can also be seized. One thing I skipped over, but should have mentioned is that there is, in addition to the detention and seizure risk, you also have the risk of monetary penalties. And there are several regulatory legislative vehicles that can lead to that. And also, but in the worst cases, criminal penalties. So we're still in this is a very new law. This is a new enforcement effort, and so penalties have been few and far between, as far as we know. But we think that is likely going to be kind of the next frontier. So that's something to keep in mind. And the third and last point is, I think maybe the listeners will be interested to know what we know about how CBP is getting smart about supply chains, which it's been really one of the hardest things, right? So customs is not used to inquiring about several tiers up the supply chain in this way, nor have necessarily supplier, the importers, right? I mean, this is a level of visibility that is unprecedented for the most part. There are some companies that are very sophisticated, the apparel companies tracing their cotton back, certainly we have that. But for most of the general population, let's call it, that hasn't been the case. So one interesting technique that customs has followed in order to get smart about supply chains, and they did this actually way before this big enforcement push, was to issue what's referred to as survey audits. Customs makes the point that they're not audits and they're just surveys, but they're audits. I mean, they feel like audits. And
arose by any other name, right? Okay.
Right. Exactly. And so the customs issues a questionnaire to a number of similarly situated companies. So, for example, all of the bigger tobacco importers, and they ask questions about what the company does to track the origin and to provide oversight over human rights issues, forced labor issues. And so that's kind of like a substantive kind of response part of the questionnaire. And then they also select some customs entries for transaction testing, where they ask the company to walk them through how they go about the process and kind of the mechanics of the importation. And so with those two, and that second, the transaction testing, the focus of that is to kind of get insight into the visibility that the importer has into the tiers in the supply chain. In other words, the traceability. And by doing that many times over and talking to many different constituents, customs has in fact gotten smart on a number of different industries. And we predict that they will continue to do that and get smarter and smarter into these industries of concern, such that when one company comes out and tells them, how great their program is, they'll say, well, thank you. I mean, this is really good information. And then they'll ask another company, well, do you have this? Because we know of other companies that are doing this or that. And so a quick example is there's new technology that is being used to trace the origin of fabric, of cotton, for example, and that is being piloted by a number of companies. And now you see customs mentioning and asking companies if they're part of that pilot and if they're using those type of technologies. So as customs learns something from one company, they're asking those questions of others, and I think that's it'll go round and around this until kind of where we reach the next phase of enforcement and so on.
So for our friends at CBP who are listening, they were already smart, but they're becoming even smarter, right?
It's shocking how smart they are at this point.
We're always quick to pat our friends in the agencies on the head and let them know that we love them and they're doing a good job. And we're not meaning to cast aspersions on them. So
I'm a former CBP.
I know,
and we love you.
I know. All right. Well, I think we're basically out of time here. Nate, let me give you maybe one last chance to sound off. If you any final thought, Richard kind of just ran through his final thoughts. Any final thought that you wanted to add that we didn't get to before we let you guys go?
I
I know you have
think
a
I would.
plane. I know you have a plane to catch. So
Yeah,
you know.
thank you. That's so thoughtful of you. But I think I would just flag a couple of areas that are sort of major challenges in this area that the companies are working through very carefully, and I'll just mention them. You know, just as areas to flag as you're getting into this area that are just useful to keep in mind. Privilege considerations as this becomes a more heavily enforced, you know, formal area of enforcement. Privilege, thinking about it, how to structure it, how to make sure that your attorneys and your auditors are working together properly. I just want to flag that as like a really important consideration for people to think about. And we've talked about the supplier cooperation point, which is really important because that is really, you know, you're going to be relying on third parties, you know, in your supply chain so much to help position you to defend yourself against these kind of things, that it's really important to sort of see things from their perspective and really, you know, understand the reasons for their objections. And one major thing that is a real obstacle that we're dealing with these days is blocking laws, like the anti-sanctions laws that have recently come about in China, that are sort of playing into this picture of the range of reasons why suppliers may be reluctant to provide information and why people may be reluctant in companies to seek that information. So I just wanted to flag those couple of issues just because they're major things people should be aware of.
Yeah, no, good final notes. I think we could spend probably another half hour talking about those couple things,
Definitely.
but we're but we are out of time. And so with that, we want to give a warm embargoed thank you to Richard and Nate for a very interesting conversation, deep dive on forced labor. Maybe deep dive on forced labor is a more politic way to title the episode, as opposed to what I suggested before. So. But we thank you guys a lot. We really appreciate it. This has been honestly very illuminating, even though we talk to you guys about these things in some form or fashion all the time, it's great to kind of really get into it in this level of detail. So we appreciate it. And thank you both. So thank you to, again, our friends and colleagues, Richard Mojica and Nate Lankford. We really appreciated their time today and their expertise and insight. That was fun. That was really interesting. I hope everybody out there appreciated sort of a different perspective on some issues that we spend a lot of time on, but we're coming at it from a totally different angle.
Yeah, I was struck by the compliance challenges and also by some of the issues related to due process. I mean, I really do think that the potential for lawsuits in this area, I think is relatively significant. But I do think that, you know, one of the issues that we talked about in terms of, you know, how would you have a good case, is something that it might take a while for a good case to percolate because some of these things will be substantively pretty hard to challenge.
Right. Yeah. And I just think in the natural course of things is as enforcement levels stay high, sooner or later, there'll be a case or two that get brought that maybe hit the right notes or have the right facts to support a challenge. And, you know, we'll have to see, just as we've seen in the other, in sanctions and export controls context, that it just kind of stars have to align to make it work. But
then I think the compliance challenges are so huge, that what is going to wind up happening most likely, and maybe this is what, you know, the enforcers want to have happen, is that once you have a region like Xinjiang that is going to be so heavily linked with forced labor, it seems to me that almost always the most efficient resource-based decision and risk-based decision is going to be to just get out of that province and try and supply your goods from elsewhere, because there's just no way to win if you do, and the risk is going up, you know, so substantially.
With as Richard said, with respect to U.S. supply chains, that may very well be the case. Of course, we know from our own discussions on these issues that that's easier said than done sometimes, and the time and the money and the effort and the politics and all the rest of it that it takes to shift that is not something that can usually be done overnight or even in a matter of a few months. It's much longer term, and so trying to forecast what's necessary, what's advisable, how do you make those smart risk-based decisions, taking into account again all risks, not just on the U.S. side
Right.
but elsewhere, is very challenging. And so there's no shortage of tough calls and tough issues that have to be navigated in this area. So with that, I think we're gonna wrap for today. We were potentially planning to do a bit of a freestyle lightning round, but we're gonna skip the lightning round for this week because we did have such a lengthy and interesting conversation with Richard and Nate. But we'll come back next time, raring to go.
Maybe an all lightning round show next time.
Maybe an all lightning round episode next time. Perhaps Tim will be recording from north of the border. We'll see. But in any event, that's all. Fingers crossed. But that's all we have for this episode. So thanks again for everybody for joining us. Hope you enjoyed. Please tune in next time. We'll be back in late July with our next episode. And until then, stay well, stay sanctions free. Thanks, everyone.
Stay sanctions free, everyone.